One of the things that I'll mention in a moment is that Ken and I have had a long time working together, as he pointed out. But I want you to know how honored I am to have been invited to speak here at this 5th annual Dinner for the Western Civilization, which I consider a very appropriate title for this event, because no organization that I know of does more to protect, preserve, and perpetuate the ideals and the values and the principles of Western civilization that does the Intercollegiate Studies Institute under the excellent leadership of Ken, and I'm very grateful for this chance to be here and to participate in this evening. As he mentioned, and I alluded to, he and I had the privilege of working together for Ronald Reagan, which was a great opportunity. Even today, when people learn of that, as I think when I go around, I'm sure Ken has had the same experience, and there are many others in the room here who had that same privilege, you get the question, what was Ronald Reagan really like? And I have answered that I believe that his most significant characteristic, personal characteristic, was his cheerfulness and his optimism. He was himself often said that he was a type of person who believed the glass was half full instead of half empty. Stan probably would have said that he was just lucky that the glass wasn't broken. But by the way, Stan, when you talked about grief counselors, you forgot about Joe the bartender at the Capitol Hilton. I think he served as a grief counselor in our days. But you know, one of Ronald Reagan's particular abilities was his sense of humor. And no matter how bad things got, he always had this ability to tell a joke or somehow lessen the tension with a good story. And when I tell people that, they always say, what's my favorite Ronald Reagan story? Well, there were a lot of stories that Ken and I and Chuck and others here all heard. Dick probably has as good a repertoire of them as anybody. But the one that I always liked the best was the story that Ronald Reagan used to tell about the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and an Irishman. And as he told this story back in the days of what they called the Troubles, when the IRA was in a battle with the British government in Northern Ireland, they had sent agents over to this country to raise money among the Irish population here. And the CIA decided they better find out what was going on over there. And so they decided to send an agent into a secret assignment. And they looked through their repertoire and found a man by the name of Murphy, and they thought that was a pretty good name to send someone to Ireland. And so they called Murphy in and told him he was going to be on a deep cover assignment. And deep cover, as they explained, meant that he was to take no radio with him because that might have been intercepted, identified him as an agent. He was to have no phone calls to the United States. He was to have no contact with headquarters whatsoever. And they told him when they needed his information, they would send a courier over to debrief him. And just so that he would know that the courier was authentic, they had a password. And the password was, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." They figured you could kind of work that into almost any conversation, so it would be all right. And so off Murphy went. And a few weeks went by, and then a few months went by, and finally they decided they better find out what he'd learned. So they dispatched the courier, and he didn't know quite where Murphy was living, but he knew probably the village. So he started at this little village where he felt that Murphy would be. And looking for an Irishman, he started in the local pub. And so he ordered whiskey. He was really a very clever guy. If he'd ordered a martini, he would have given himself away. But he ordered this whiskey and engaged the bartender in conversation. And they talked about the weather, and they talked about the crops, and in the course of the conversation, he said, "By the way, I'm looking for a man named Murphy." Well, the bartender said, "You know, we've got an awful lot of Murphys around here. There's Murphy the bootmaker, and he has a little place across the road. There's Murphy the farmer, and he has a place 2 miles down that way, and just happens my name is Murphy too." So the courier casually takes another sip of his drink and says, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." "Oh," says the bartender, "you want Murphy the spy. He lives around the corner." Well, you know, the president used his sense of humor, he uses his ability to engage in humor in a number of ways. He used it often to to make a point. He used it sometimes to relieve tension, as I mentioned, and sometimes he used it even to offset the attacks by his opponents. He was particularly had opportunities to do that when cracks came or questions came about his age. You remember he was the oldest person ever to serve in the presidency. And so he often talked about the founders. And when he was doing that, and he talked about the writing of the Constitution, and he said, of course, I wasn't personally there at the time, just in case anybody had any doubts. But it's about that Constitution that I would like to talk tonight, and particularly because I believe that our Constitution is one of the most important documents to encapsulate the absolutely critical principles of Western civilization. And I'd like to talk particularly about what I see, and it's already been referred to by Stan and by Ken, to the challenges to the Constitution, and particularly to constitutional government that we are facing today as a nation. In the statement of principles of a free society that guide ISI, it provides among them that the rule of law is a key value. And in explaining that, it says that laws, not men, rule a free society. The Constitution of the United States, with its division of powers, is the best arrangement yet devised for empowering government while preventing the concentration of power. Well, to understand the importance of this principle, we have to go back to 1787 in Philadelphia. And I'm sure you all know your history about what went on there, the importance of that meeting in the middle of the summer. But I think it's important to go beyond the historical lesson and really look at the dynamics of what occurred there and how it relates to this issue that I'm raising today. And that is because the founders had a dilemma. The initial government that had been put together by the 13 new states wasn't working. They needed what they viewed as a stronger national government to do things that the states couldn't do themselves. For example, in the field of national defense, they needed an army and a navy. And that was because at that time, the United States was looked upon by other nations as very weak. And so other countries were making incursions onto our northern and southern borders. Our ships at sea were being attacked, in some cases by pirates, but more often by foreign navies. Looked as kind of simpletons by the older, haughtier nations of Europe, and England, Spain, France, other countries like that. And that was because we couldn't engage really in making treaties, because a treaty had to be ratified then by all 13 states, which was a difficult and often impossible project. At home, we had similar problems. We needed some means of regulating commerce among the states, because state after state was putting up barriers to trade in order to advantage their own products. We needed a nationwide currency system, and we needed a postal system so that people could communicate across the growing country. Well, the founders wanted a central government with sufficient energy, as they called it, so that it could carry out these truly national functions. But they didn't want a government so strong that it would be oppressive, and they were worried about about a return of the kind of treatment they had received under King George III. And so you had this traditional conflict of governmental authority versus liberty. Well, the founders, as you know, were well educated. They'd studied other civilizations, other countries. They knew their history, they knew their law. And so they developed the idea that the key to solving this dilemma of authority versus liberty was power, and how you handled power. And the ways that they devised to handle power was basically to disperse it. And so they divided power vertically and horizontally. Vertically, of course, there was a limited number of powers that were allocated to the national or federal government, those things that were truly national in scope. But all other governmental authority, as I said in the 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, was reserved to the states, remained with the states, because that's where the power had come from initially to form the national government, or with the people, which were the ultimate holders of power. And the power that was given to the federal government was itself dispersed among three separate and independent branches. The legislative power, as you remember, went to Congress, and it was again divided into a House of Representatives and a Senate. The executive power was given to the President, and through the President to those officials that he appointed or who formed the executive branch, but always responsible to the President, who was responsible to the people. And the judicial power was given to an independent judiciary, one of the first in the history of the world. And they also instituted, however, checks and balances, because just dispersing power wasn't enough. And so they allowed Congress to pass the laws, but at the same time allowed the President to veto. And they gave to the President the power to appoint the officials of government, but they had to be confirmed by the Senate. Now, the judiciary, in order to be independent, had to be a little different. And that was the fact that they were appointed by the President, but also had to be confirmed by the Senate, the judges. And they were limited in the function, in the sense that the Constitution gave them power. It was the power only to interpret the law, not to make the law or to carry out the law. Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers that the judiciary was the weakest of the three branches because it had neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword. They were unable to appropriate money for themselves. They were dependent on Congress for that, and they did not execute the decisions that they themselves made, which had to be done by the executive. Well, the key to the success of this arrangement was a written constitution. Again, something that was totally new in the world. There were other constitutions indeed, but none of them were written. As lawyers would say today, they got it in writing. And so this was the embodiment of the power of federal government, of the federal government and the federal agencies, coming from the people, carrying out the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, that the just powers of government are derived from the consent of the governed. And that's why the Constitution starts, as you remember, with those big words, big letters in most constitutions, copies of it, "We the people," because that was where the power came from, and it was through the people's elected representatives that their wishes were carried out. As a matter of fact, the primacy of the consent of the governed and the primacy of the Constitution is reflected in the oath that our military and our public officials take. And the reason for that is evident, really, because most countries, as their officials take office, they swear an oath to the king or the monarch or whoever the person is that heads their government. In the United States, we take an oath to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States, because that is the embodiment of the consent of the governed. Randy Barnett, Professor Randy Barnett, who was present last night in the panel that Ken talked about, put it this way. He said, "The government is the law that powers those who govern us. It is a device to address the age-old problem, who guards the people from their guardians?" Well, certainly over the years there have been challenges to the Constitution in many ways. For example, the three branches of government regularly have jousted with each other. If you go to President Andrew Jackson or various other presidents along the way, there were all kinds of battles between the executive branch and the court. Jefferson had some very mean things to say about the justices. Lincoln wasn't too happy with them either. So there was a lot of controversy, but it was always within the framework of the Constitution and an agreement that the Constitution was supreme. The Civil War, or as Ken would say, the War of Northern Aggression, was perhaps the most serious challenge to the continued existence of our country under the Constitution. But I would suggest to you today that we have a most insidious challenge to the Constitution. It began 100 years ago. It began with a group composed primarily of academics, political scientists, pundits, and writers. They called themselves the Progressives. It evolved into what was known as the Progressive Reform Movement. It was very different from the founders' concept of what constitutional government should be. To understand the original concept, Professor Bruce Fronin has described the standard that Washington, Madison, and others who had labored in Philadelphia that summer and later were the first people to implement the Constitution, what they decided and devised as a government that would protect the liberty of the people. And Professor Fronin wrote, "The United States Constitution gives fewer powers to the rulers than do almost any constitution in the world for two reasons. First, Americans sought less from government than do many peoples. They already had families, churches, local communities, and especially customs that helped them lead the kind of lives they wanted to lead. And second, Americans already had governments in their states. The American Constitution is not the rules that govern our society. It is not itself even the rules that order all of government. It is the rules that govern our national, our federal government, and that are intended to keep that government within its proper bounds." Well, again, turning to the principles of a free society as formulated by ISI, we see that the articulation of limited government explains what the Constitution and what Professor Fronin talked about really means. In describing limited government, these principles say, "The rightful functions of government are to guarantee individual liberty, private property, internal order, the provision of national defense, and the administration of justice. When the state exceeds this proper rule, it accumulates power and becomes a threat to personal liberty." Well, the progressive movement went in a 180-degree opposite direction. Dr. Matt Spaulding, who's the director of our Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation, put it this way. He said, "Progressive thinkers, as they called themselves, sought to, quote, refound, unquote, America according to ideas that were alien to Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Madison. Repudiating the founders' belief in the existence of self-evident truths, so-called progressives asserted that there are no truths, only relative values. Similarly, they claimed, man enjoys no permanent rights endowed by God, only changing rights held at the indulgence of government." And then went on to say, "By denying eternal truths and rights, they felt that Americans must be governed by a, quote, living, unquote, constitution, one that endlessly evolves and grows with the times." Well, obviously nothing could have been further from the concept of the founders. The progressive movement, first under a Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt, and then a Democratic one, Woodrow Wilson, set forth the platform of modern American liberalism. And to them, they thought that government would be able to engineer a society that involved what they saw as the end result of their hope to be way in which the world worked, particularly the United States, and that was assuring equal outcomes and redistributing wealth. Their idea was that the best thing that could happen would be a distant, patronizing welfare state that regulates more and more of our economy, our politics, and our society. Well, that was the beginning of this so-called progressive movement. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society were grand steps that attempted to achieve this progressive, as they called it, agenda. Well, after a while, the progressive name was dropped, and the supporters of larger and more powerful government were known, as most of us knew it for so many years, as the liberals. But whether liberals or progressives, the theme was the same. They insisted that the modern world is so complex and so problematic that activist government is required to manage political life as well as human affairs. As Dr. Spaulding continued, he said, "This new liberalism seeks to transform America's constitutional structure of limited government into an increasingly powerful, centralized government focused on supposed social reform." The rise of the modern administrative state, the growth of bureaucracy that takes place at every level, and the host of benefits that the public has come to expect from government all undercut and pervert the American idea of self-government.
Well, fortunately, progressive ideas have not completely won the day. Indeed, over the years, they have been relegated at times to a bunch of true believers on college campuses. At other times, they have risen to be practiced in some cities, some states, and they've invaded some of the areas of the federal government and the ideas of members of Congress. But the dominance of progressive arguments have continued to exist in our schools and in the public square, as well as in some of our politics. And as a result, they've significantly weakened the foundations of American constitutionalism and limited government. Even our language has been affected by these ideas, and today we regularly accept the concept of entitlements, if you will, as the current depiction of what we used to call government handouts. Today, the leftists and the liberals have begun going all the way around in a circle, calling themselves progressives again. That's because liberal became a dirty word in politics. And although liberal became a dirty word, some of the ideas, unfortunately, have not been rejected as they should. And that's why the status dogma and the status goals that they espouse continue to constitute the same challenge to limited government that those who have been fighting for limited government and fighting the ideas of liberals and leftists throughout the past century have come to realize as the danger that they are to our system of government. And of course, that in a real way is the responsibility that ISI is undertaking, and that is to get across to each emerging generation the truth about American history, the truth about Western civilization, and the truth about the values and why the concepts of the framers are as important today as they ever have been. But today, as we look at what's going on, all three branches of the federal government have furnished examples of this abandonment from time to time of constitutional principles. The recent health care debate showed the disdain, for example, that members of Congress have for the Constitution. I'm sure you were all somewhat shocked as the reports came out about the instance when one reporter dared to ask the Speaker of the House of Representatives, where does the Constitution grant Congress the authority to require individual citizens to buy health insurance? The Speaker was obviously annoyed and replied, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" In other words, what does the Constitution have to do with the legislation we're passing? Another member of the House of Representatives, a long-time member, was asked about the same legislation, and particularly whether there was any limitation on the power of Congress. And after thinking a moment, he responded, "No, I think the federal government can do almost anything." Well, this reveals how public officials who have taken an oath to support the Constitution consider that it has no relevance to modern governance. When we turn to the executive branch, we have more of the same. Some of their actions in recent months fly directly in the face of the Declaration of Independence. Most of us are familiar with the opening paragraphs of the Declaration, where it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," and so on. But less well known is the fact that most of the Declaration is really a list of complaints against the King of England. My favorite complaint is the one that says that the King has erected a multitude of new offices and sent forth swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. And that's from people who've never heard of OSHA or the EPA. Well, 200 years later, those words are applicable again, as the current administration has created a proliferation of what they call Czars in the management of the federal government. Now, Czar, as you know, is not an official title, but it is a shortened term that's used by the news media, as well as many in government, to describe the numerous new positions, both in the White House and in the various departments and agencies of the government, who carry out the work of an ever-increasing and expanding bureaucracy. The term czar has been used sparingly in some previous administrations, but today there is a proliferation of powerful officials who are in positions of authority where the title is indeed an appropriate description. One recent article actually pointed out, after doing a little historical research, that today there are more czars in the federal government than there were in the entire history of the Russian Empire. Well, there's several problems about these czars that is more than kind of a humorous title. First, most are in new positions that are involved with new agencies or new powers in the federal government. For example, just that health care bill that's kind of pending now, which hasn't gone into total effect or even very little effect yet, but bodes very poorly for the future. But in that bill are created 159 new agencies of the government and well over 200 abilities of the federal government to issue new regulations. Beyond that, many of the czars are located in the White House as part of the president's staff, where they are very powerful but exempt from the confirmation process that is set forth itself in the Constitution. And third, having czars in the White House with authority over some issues and many programs that are normally handled by the cabinet departments causes confusion over responsibility and avoids accountability because the White House station czars are immune from questioning by Congress. Going even further, the current administration has chosen to totally ignore the confirmation process in some cases by bogus use of recess appointments without even submitting the nominations of the people to the Senate, as has usually been the case in every other situation where recess appointments are used. Usually the reason they have done this is because the candidate that they would have otherwise nominated could not withstand congressional scrutiny. Again, in the judicial branch, activist federal judges at all levels are usurping the functions of the legislative and the executive branches, misusing their constitutional authority to be judges by overruling actions undertaken and entrusted by the Constitution to the elected branches, or in other ways substituting their own personal views, political biases, or policy preferences for what the Constitution and the statutes enacted under it actually say. As an example, this has been true in the statutes this has been true in terms of the conduct of our current wars and military operations, matters the Constitution specifically gives authority to the President as Commander-in-Chief and to the Congress to make the rules for our military forces, as well as a number of issues that have been related to things like marriage, the environment, and even fundamental rights such as freedom of speech and religious liberty. Well, how can our country then respond and to restore the founders' concept of constitutional government? Once again, I would suggest to you that the wisdom of the founders can enlighten and inspire us. James Madison, in The Federalist, number 44, put it this way. He said, "What is to be the consequence in case the Congress," and I would add the other two branches, "shall misconstrue the Constitution and exercise powers not warranted by its true meaning?" And he went on to give the solution. He said, "I answer, the same as if they should misconstrue or enlarge any other power vested in them, a remedy must be obtained from the people, who can, by the elections of more faithful representatives, annul the acts of the usurpers." Well, both Ken and Stan Evans have indicated in a reference to this that we've had an experience of more responsible representatives, at least we hope so, being elected by the people to annul the acts of the usurpers. The tremendous involvement of citizens, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and others, has been the most significant development on the modern political scene. Again, our previous speakers have made reference to that. But look at what's happened. The Tea Party movement, with numerous separate groups and literally thousands of individual local organizations, are there where regular meetings and regular events that they sponsor always include discussions and reading of the Constitution. We've also seen the outpouring of citizens themselves as individuals or families attending the town halls that have been organized with members of Congress. I might say an attendance not always welcomed by the members of Congress themselves. There are the expanded efforts of numerous grassroots organizations at the local, state, and national levels. Beyond that, the number of people actually reading the Constitution is, I believe, at an all-time high. At Heritage, as many of you know, we send copies of the Constitution to anyone who applies through the internet or at a special phone number that we use in our advertising. To date, we have distributed 4.5 million copies of the Constitution. I might add that in the booklets that contain the Constitution, we also include the Declaration of Independence, and just so they understand the oath of office that is taken by judges and other public officials. To go on, new efforts are being made to restore the founders' concept of federalism and to reassert the proper balance of power between the states and the national government. There's a 10th Amendment caucus and a 10th Amendment task force that is in Congress designed to support changes to check the power of the federal government, which has been exercised at the expense of the states. Efforts are underway to promote the reinstatement of the federalism policymaking and the federalism executive order that Chuck Cooper, who's here tonight, was instrumental in getting developed during the Reagan administration, which unfortunately was revoked during the Clinton era. Well, these are the kinds of things that are happening. There is, of course, from this, a lot of good news. And these are but a few of the encouraging signs of citizen action and the steps that are being taken to restore constitutional government and to thwart the pernicious policies of progressivism. But it's, as has been pointed out, it's a large task. We're trying to undo what has really been decades, and particularly an intensity of the last few years, in terms of the so-called progressive agenda. And that's why equally important to what's happening now as a start, at an effort that must continue, expand, and occupy the attention of citizens throughout the country. Equally important is what ISI is doing. Not only to look at what our needs are now, but also to provide for the future by increasing the civic literacy and accurate knowledge of history and civics for emerging generations. In the 1830s, a foreign visitor, Alexis de Tocqueville, was fascinated by what he saw going on in the United States. He was a student of Western civilization and a keen observer of cultures and people. In his book, Democracy in America, which I'm sure is a staple for ISI students, he described this new nation, under its unique constitution, as a special land of individual liberty, limited government, economic freedom, personal commitment, community responsibility, and civic virtue. Meeting today's challenge to our Constitution and restoring the founders' concept of freedom and responsibility, we must ensure that we can continue to deserve Tocqueville's description of our exceptional nature.